Hello, hope you're doing well. So usually I only do digital art in my videos, but some of you may remember that a while back I actually made a video in collaboration with the lovely folks over at ArrtX where I showed you guys a bit of my traditional art process. Well, recently it was the 1-year anniversary of ArrtX releasing the ALP series of alcohol markers that I reviewed last time. And to celebrate, they got back in touch with me and sent over not only a really cute collection of anniversary goodies, which was very kind of them, but also some more pens for me to review, specifically from their brand new collection of pastel-colored markers. I mentioned in my last ArrtX review video that I was really looking forward to seeing more of what they could do in the way of paler pastel-colored markers, so I was very excited to try these out. Before I dive into trying them out though, let me show you just what it is I'm going to be working with today. First off, we have a pack with an aesthetic that might look quite familiar if you saw my last ArrtX video. This pastel collection is the latest addition to the ALP series of marker pens, which all come in these really pretty decorative boxes with lids that you can flip open to prop them up horizontally on your desk for easy access while you work. Just like all of the ALP series markers, the pens in this box are double-ended, with both a fine-tipped bullet nib and a wider chisel-shaped nib on the other side. So you have multiple options to play with when it comes to choosing the thickness of the color that you're applying. Besides the pens themselves, this pack also contains a decorative postcard and a thank you note from ArrtX, as well as a numbered swatching sheet that you can use to test out all of these lovely colors. At first, I fully thought that this was going to be the only pack I'd be reviewing today, but to my surprise, midway through filling out the swatching sheet for this one no less, I heard my doorbell ring. And inside the package I received when I answered it was another pack of markers. But as you can see, it does look a bit different to the sets that I've reviewed up till now. And that's because it's actually from ArrtX's OROS series of marker pens, which I haven't tried before. The main difference you'll notice straight away is that pens from the OROS series tend to come in these woven bags instead of boxes. This one in particular came with a nice long carry strap, so right off the bat this set seems like it would be great for anybody who needs their equipment to be portable. The other very exciting difference between ArrtX's ALP markers and their OROS markers is the pens themselves. Like I said earlier, the ALP markers have a chisel nib and a bullet nib combination. And while the pens from the OROS series are also double-ended, one of those ends is a brush nib. I've never actually had brush-tipped alcohol markers before now because it's always been so hard to find good ones that aren't crazy expensive, so evidently I was really excited when I popped the cap of one of these and realized exactly what it was that I was holding. The pens in this pack can also be put into a little grid, which can be removed or put back into the bag as you need, and propped up on a stand that you can assemble really quickly out of these little laser cut pieces that are included with the rest of the set. The bag these markers come in also has a handy-dandy pocket on the front and I think one inside as well, which are just the right size to keep those pieces in when they're not in use. Besides the pens anyway, this pack, much like the other one, also contains a postcard and a thank you note, as well as a swatching sheet that you can use to familiarize yourself with all the colors. There was also a sheet of ArrtX themed stickers in this box, and a helpful instructional guide on how to use and properly store your pens. Now, although they're from different lines, ALP and OROS respectively, both of these packs are the pastel editions of their respective series. So it's probably worth mentioning that the colors of the pens included in each of these packs are exactly the same. Obviously, like I showed you, they do have physical differences, like they have different nibs and stuff between the two sets, but having taken a look at both of the swatching sheets, the numbers and the names of the colors that are included in both of these boxes are exactly the same. You have the same 40 included in each of them, so you wouldn't need to buy both of these packs basically to have the complete pastel collection. They are each complete in their own right, they just have different functions. So for the most part, if you're not sure which of these marker collections would be better suited to the way that you work, the main functional difference is mostly going to be whether you prefer pens with a bullet nib or a brush nib. With that in mind, I always want to try and show you guys the most of what these markers can do in these kind of review videos. So, in order to try them out properly, and after taking a bit of inspiration from the fact that the months are changing and we are finally entering my favorite time of year, I decided to do some festive fashion drawings inspired by all the different seasons. Hopefully it's a concept that's going to give us a real nice range of color combinations to work with, so let's get to it. Before I started recording these, I decided that the best and most evenly distributed, I guess, kind of way to go about testing out both of these packs would be to work on 2 designs using the ALP markers, and then 2 more designs using the OROS markers. So I decided to split the seasons down the middle and do these fashion, costume, character design things in chronological order. This first page I'm working on here has a spring-themed character on the left, and a more summery-looking one on the right. And for these two designs, I'm going to be using the markers from the Alp collection. As you can see, I also did the penciling for these drawings in advance before I started filming. That was partially because I actually wasn't sure how much memory I had left on my phone while I was working on these, and I didn't want to record any non-essential stuff like penciling in case it meant that I would run out of memory when it got to doing the actual interesting stuff, like the coloring. But I also decided to sketch the characters out before I started recording because of the challenge presented by working with a collection of nothing but pastel-colored pens. Basically, I wasn't really sure what exactly these characters were going to end up looking like when I first put my pencil to paper. So as you might expect, there was a fair bit of erasing and adjustment and like page turning involved before I actually started inking these, so it would have been a bit of a nightmare to watch back when I sped up the footage because my sketchbook would have been flying all over the screen as I rotated it. But yeah, once I had at least a rough idea of which direction I was taking them in, I put my sketchbook in the middle of my table, started my camera, and I picked up the brush-tipped fine liner that I normally use to do my traditional inking with, and I got to work. The general ideas I landed on for these two were that I wanted the spring character to have a sunny, friendly, like gardener kind of look to them, and then for the summer character to be decked out in beachwear and looking very ready for the sunshine. You might also notice that as a final detail, I gave these characters little wings, and while I hadn't originally thought I'd end up drawing a bunch of fairies for this video, there is actually a reason for it. So last year, of course, I did show you guys the really varied collection of skin tone markers that ArrtX does have available, but obviously that's not the point of this particular collection of colours, and I was trying to stick to just the pens in these packs this time around, so of course there weren't as many ordinary human kind of skin tones available. But limiting yourself to a particular palette doesn't mean that you should have to limit the variation in your character designs. Also, as a side note while we're on the subject of colour palettes, before colouring with traditional materials, I always try to make sure to test out the colours that I have available. Specifically when using ArrtX pens, I tend to test them out both on the swatching sheets provided, and on a scrap of the type of paper that I'm going to be using for the piece, since the way they dry can vary a bit depending on what kind of paper you're using. Apparently though, ArrtX also recently launched their own brand of sketchbooks with paper that's like designed to work really well with their pens, so I think I might need to check those out at some point, but for now I'm just working with my ordinary sketchbook. So at some point after I filled out the swatching sheets and saw like which colours I was going to be working with exactly, I figured that instead of just like giving every single character the same skin tone, it might be fun to try and draw some characters with more fantastical skin tones like blue and pink and green, which might also feed quite nicely into whatever colour schemes these characters would end up having. And yeah, pretty much the first thing I thought of in that direction when I tried to come up with like fantastical folks to draw was fairies, so that is the route I went down, and now we're here. Speaking of their colour schemes anyway, I tried to stick to just one or two main colours for each of these characters. Usually I do try and limit my colour schemes like that regardless, because I don't tend to enjoy including like 7 different contrasting colours all in one design. Some people can really make that work, but for me it just gets a bit too busy looking to handle after a certain point, so not entirely my cup of tea. But this time around in particular, I also realised that because I was going to be working with an entirely pale-toned colour palette, it might be difficult to build up the usual kind of contrast and values that I tend to try and incorporate into my costume designs. A lot of the time I tend to at least try and draw outfits with like clearly contrasting lighter and darker sections of clothing, and usually I try and put those sections right next to each other because it helps the different areas of the design stand out, and just overall having more cleaner cut sections like that does help to keep a character design a lot more readable. The best example I can always think of for like readability, because it seems like such an abstract concept, is like how in the old-timey cartoons, like the black and white cartoons, all of the characters would have white gloves on, and that's just so that like when they start moving you can still see their hands when they cross over their bodies. The short version of this is that having like very clear-cut light and dark sections tends to help differentiate the different parts of a character, right? But at the minute, the only example I can think of is the old-timey cartoons analogy, so I really hope that it makes sense. Thankfully though, we're not just working with black and white ink here, and there is more than one way to keep the different parts of a picture distinct from each other. So yeah, long story short, in place of my usual methods of kind of tonal value light and dark based color picking. I tried to feature one or two seasonally appropriate colors that would contrast enough with each other to be able to act as the main building blocks for each character. Essentially, they would be the colors that covered the most ground and be used for the biggest chunks. And then if I felt like it needed it, I could always add a little splash of a different, like, highlight color here and there for just any small details. For the spring character, I went with a nice fresh collection of yellows and greens, and I thought there was a really good range of those colors in this pastel collection. Everything from sunny golden yellows to sharper yellow greens to kind of more natural looking mossy greens, which, like you can see, I used for her little welly boots and stuff like that. So I had plenty to choose from while working on that character, and I also ended up adding some little spots of pink to the flowers around her just to give everything a little bit more variation. For the summer character, I ended up going with a mix of warm pinks and cool purples. Originally, I was thinking of using, like, reds and oranges and yellows for her, because, like, you know, it's summer, it's hot, the sun is hot and the sun is red and orange and yellow. But then I realized that I would actually need to use a very similar color palette for the autumn character. So, yeah, in the end, I just opted for that more summer sunset kind of vibe instead, which thankfully does still match her outfit quite nicely, so it all worked out in the end. I'm also really glad that it gave me a chance to actually use some of the purple markers that came in this collection. Not to spoil the next two character designs for you, of course, but purple isn't really a key feature in either of them, so yeah, it was nice to use it here. I think it made for a very nice kind of... Man, I don't even know what this is called, I just know that people wear it to the beach sometimes, but this kind of like skirt wrap jacket combination. Somebody who understands fashion, please explain it to me in the comments. I have no idea what it's called, oh no. Overall, anyway, these markers from the Alp box did a really good job, but honestly that was no surprise. Like I said at the start of this video, they are the kind of marker pen that I am the most used to personally, so they felt nice and familiar to use, even though the colours within these specific ones were all shiny and new. As you can see, I used the chisel-tipped end of the pens kind of the most to fill in the larger areas here, like the Spring Fairies dungarees and the skin tone of the summer design. It can be daunting to tackle large areas when you're working with alcohol markers, because you really don't want to end up with streaks all across the thing that you've spent so long colouring. But thankfully, at least in my experience, as long as you keep going while the ink is still wet, any overlapping sections do tend to fade and blend together as it dries, so it does still end up looking nice and smooth. For any areas where I wanted to blend colours together further in order to deepen the shade, like when I add some blush to a character's cheeks, for example, okay, so in other ArrtX collections that I've used previously, there's usually a colourless blender included among the pens, which is supposed to be very helpful for that kind of thing. But it's probably quite important to mention here that there is no blender included in either of these pastel boxes. Perhaps fortunately for me in this situation though, maybe, I never actually learned how to use those blending pens in the first place. There is a method to it, people have explained it to me, but I personally just never got the hang of it, so my method for layering and blending colours really is much the same as my method for just applying a massive swathe of it, which is to say, just keep working while the ink is wet. I wish I could say there was more science to it than that, or more like amazing technical theory, but I just kind of like keep going while it's soggy and I pray, and that's that's how I colour. But yeah, as long as you build up little by little in terms of how much darker the next pen that you apply is, yeah, I don't know, that technique has not failed me yet. Personally, that kind of wet blending is another thing that I tend to use the wider end of the pen for as well, but if you wanted to go back and like add more defined streaks of colour or detail on top of an area where the ink has already dried, then the bullet nib on the other end of the marker is really helpful to go back and do that with. In fact, I think I did exactly that when I was defining the woven pattern on top of the summer character's hat. The only area where I really wasn't sure if that usual wet blending method of mine was going to work was on the pool floaty that I also gave to the summer character. Inexplicably, I really don't know why, but colouring that kind of semi-see-through plasticky material in particular is something that I've really started enjoying this year. For some reason, it's just become a really fun design element for me, and I keep including it in the characters that I draw. However, usually, I colour that kind of material on my computer, so needless to say, the process here was a little bit different. It was also a bit daunting because even though, like I say, I don't normally make use of the clear marker when it's included in a pack like this because I am a fool, I also knew going into that section that I probably wouldn't be able to use that wet blending method because there wasn't any clear or like white ink going underneath the colour that I was about to apply as a base, so there was nothing to blend into. Fortunately though, because this is of course a pastel collection, a bunch of the markers that I ended up using to try and fill in that pool floaty texture were just kind of pale enough that I could apply them directly to the paper and still achieve the nice translucent effect I was going for. All in all, I am really happy with how these two designs turned out. It was really nice to play around with all of these pale colours, and I think it's safe to say that this test run of the Alp pack was a big success. Which means it's time to change up our tools and try out the OROS brush-tipped markers. Also, I forgot to mention before, but the eagle-eyed among you may have already noticed that the surface I'm working on in this video is actually not the same one as the last time I did one of these top-down traditional art kind of videos. I haven't actually changed my workspace setup since last time though. I just ended up using the table in my front room instead of my actual work desk because I found out that I can actually clamp my camera stand to the back of the table where it's supposed to be, unlike how on my actual work desk I have no choice but to clamp it directly in front of where I need to sit, which makes doing any traditional videos there pretty uncomfortable. In hindsight, I feel rather silly for not having thought of just using a different table the last time I made one of these, but at least I didn't have to stand up and give myself a bad back while I was working on these drawings, so you live and learn. Anyway, with spring and summer out of the way, that just leaves autumn and winter. And not to be biased, but who am I kidding? I'm absolutely about to be biased. They are my two favourite seasons. I was actually able to wear a cardigan when I went out the other day, and as I started setting up this recording today, I am currently wearing like 2 hoodies, I had a cup of tea, and I'm still cold. I am absolutely living. It's a wonderful time. But yeah, I figured in the spirit of this cold weather that is now fast approaching, and I welcome it gladly, I figured it would also be nice to maybe deck these characters out in similarly comfy, cozy, temperature-appropriate outfits. So just like with the last two, I did a bit of pencil work in advance just to try and figure out some kind of good looks for each of them, and then I took to inking them with a fine liner. Something that will probably come as a surprise to exactly no one is that the design for the autumn character came to me pretty easily. Who could have seen that coming? Not me. Like I say, it's cardigan weather now, so I gave her a nice big chunky cardigan, a probably caffeinated festive drink because I am an absolute hoe for an October coffee, and I couldn't resist, and some chunky boots inspired by kind of those ones that you see sometimes with like wings attached to the ankle, but with leaves instead of feathers. I also had the idea to put her hair up in these two, like, big leaf-shaped bunches as well, and I actually love how much that added to the overall vibe of her design. For the winter character, I muddled around with a couple of different options before settling on giving her a long winter coat and an umbrella. At first I was going to give her a rounder, fluffier kind of hairstyle as well, but she ended up overall seeming like more of a cool, icy character than a snowy one in the end, so yeah, a spiky hairstyle seemed like it suited her just a bit better. For the most part with this character design though, I just really wanted to try and include a bunch of that kind of smooth, shiny adjacent kind of material, you know, like the kind you get on snow jackets and like winter gear that you can kind of, you put your hand across it and it makes like that kind of sound. Because I felt like it would probably lend itself really well to the flow of the brush markers. But yeah, putting my terrible description of fabrics to one side, let's take a look at how the colouring actually went. First up was the autumn-themed character here, and like I said earlier, I knew right from the get-go with this one that they were going to need to have a colour scheme comprised of those kind of classic autumny reds, oranges, and yellows. But one thing that I forgot when I was picking up pens and actually applying them to the paper here is that, again, this is a pastel collection, and all the colours are like pale blue and pale yellow and stuff like that, right? And pale red, in a lot of cases, as it turns out, is what many people may describe as pink. I swear you would not know that I do art for a living half the time because I really do be out here forgetting the simplest things. So yeah, at first, some of the areas I was colouring that in my mind's eye were supposed to be more of a browny orange did turn out more of a springtime pink than intended. But once I realised my mistake, I picked up a couple more pens, a bit more carefully this time around, and layered some more of the kind of pale oranges and browns I was looking for on top of those areas, and eventually they got to where I was trying to get them in the first place. Much like with the range of yellows and greens that I used for the springtime character as well, there seemed to be a really nice amount of those kind of warm-toned colours included in both of these packs. So even though I may have forgotten how colours worked for a hot second while I was working on this one, it still felt like there were plenty of other pens that I could choose from to come in and pick up the slack. Now again, these OROS markers are the ones that are rocking the brush tip and chisel tip combo, and although I did use the chisel tip a lot while I was working with the Alp series markers on the previous two designs, I actually ended up using the OROS's brush tips pretty much exclusively for the entirety of the colouring on both of these ones. You should be able to see on the Autumn character's jeans, for example, I used more of a line-based cross-hatching kind of method to fill in the colour, and then for areas like her hair, I tried to keep the blending really nice and smooth and build up a bit more of a gradient effect. And yeah, the brush tips just ended up being versatile enough to use for both of those quite different colouring techniques and everything in between. Another thing I forgot to mention on the previous two designs, by the way, is that I do usually go in and add a bit of extra detail with a white gel pen once I've finished colouring my traditional drawings. So I did just that on the Autumn character here, added a bit of sparkle and definition to the cardigan, and then it was on to the fourth and final character. Now, admittedly, the design for this wintry fairy lady is probably the least creative, especially when I see it right next to the Autumn character like this, but they can't all be winners, and also I mostly just wanted to use this one as an excuse to draw an outfit with a nice big surface area to try out some blending on, so in that regard at least, it understood the assignment, and I am at peace with that. I will say though, I don't dislike this design. I do quite like how the boots turned out on it, and you already know I enjoy any costume with any kind of fluff on it, so it does have that going for it as well. The colour scheme I ended up using for this character anyway was all in the blue area. As you can see, once again, there was plenty to choose from. I used more of a minty turquoise for her skin tone, and then some deeper blues to fill in her outfit. Initially, I was thinking about adding some purple as well, either to the shading or maybe as a standalone pop of colour like the flowers on the springtime character, but it ended up looking pretty good with just the blues, and I did not want to push my luck. I think I mentioned this the last time I made a video with markers as well, but typically I also try and leave a bit of white space around the edges of whatever I'm colouring, just to kind of give them a bit of a rim light effect and make everything look a bit less flat. And as with the Autumn one, I think I pretty much only ended up using the brush-tipped end of the pens for the colouring here, although if this were a bigger drawing, I think I probably would have used the chisel tip end to add a few, like, wider, square-shaped kind of streaks, or like rectangular, you know what I mean, to the shading on the coat, because more of a blocky colouring style like that would probably also work really nicely for the kind of texture that I was trying to display here. Like I said earlier, I have always kind of coveted the idea of having a set of brush tip marker pens like these. Like when I was a kid, they were always the drawing tool that you would see all of the professional manga artists using and stuff like that, so basically if you were a teenage anime fan, you wanted these kind of pens in some capacity. So yeah, it was really nice to be able to give these pens a go here and kind of fulfill that childhood dream. And it was even nicer to find out that they are indeed just as fantastic of a piece of drawing equipment as I expected them to be when I was a kid. At the end of the day though, finding the right art equipment for yourself comes down entirely to your preferences, your style, and just your overall way of working. But hopefully if you're having a tough time choosing between brush tips and bullet nibs at least, this video can maybe go some way to showing you just how useful either one can be. Also, bit of a topic jump, but I realize now that I never actually gave any of these characters a name, so I'm gonna go ahead and open the floor to you guys on that one. Please do feel free to leave any name suggestions you might have for these seasonal fairy people down in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, maybe you could also let me know if there are any other ArrtX materials that you think are worth mentioning. Obviously, I've tried a handful of them out in videos now myself, but I still don't really use traditional materials very often, and there are still quite a few tools and collections that I haven't tried, so yeah, it would just be really cool to hear what kind of stuff you guys recommend, and then hopefully I can try it sometime. In the meantime though, why don't we go ahead and take a closer look at how all of today's designs turned out. Well, there we have it. A whole bunch of seasonal designs that were a whole lot of fun to work on. Thanks so much again to ArrtX for sponsoring this video. Honestly, just some of my favorite folks to work with, and if it wasn't already clear enough, I really appreciated getting the chance to try out these pens. If you want to check out either of these pastel packs, or indeed any of ArrtX's other marker pens for yourself, I would obviously recommend them very highly, and you can find all of their links and stuff down in the description. For now anyway, thank you ever so much for tuning in. I hope you had fun drawing with me today, and I hope you're all staying as safe, happy, and healthy as you possibly can. I'll see you next time.